Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading to some cabin in the woods for a collection of creepy stories. So get comfortable by the fire and let the darkness take control. This happened when I was 15, near Alcaguin Park. My father and I were driving up to our cottage in the middle of winter. I was always so amazed at the beauty of the park and Muskoka, and had grown up enjoying the beauty of it every summer. Our cottage was on a large lake, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. There were probably thousands of cottages on the lake. During the summer, the lake and the town's population tripled. It was cottage county, so people would spend all summer enjoying the lake and the warm nights around campfires with family and friends. I spent every summer there growing up, and it still brings fond memories of sunshine and laughter and the sound of motorboats on the lake. But the winters were different. The people that didn't live there all year round ventured back home to city life, leaving the area mostly deserted, with cottages boarded up for the winter. There were a few people that still frequented and would come up every few months for a few days or so. But for the most part, the lake was silent during winters, and the town was just filled with the locals. The beautiful pine trees are always covered with snow, making the forest quiet. Our cottage was on a dead-end road. There were about 20 other cottages on the road, with ours being somewhat in the middle. The cottages were quite spaced out. However, with our closest neighbour being too far away to see through the trees, my dad had needed to head up to the cottage to do some painting that my mum had been bugging him to do. It was at the end of February, and it was a long weekend, so I tagged along so he wouldn't be alone, and so that we could spend some quality time together. It was about a 5-hour drive from our home, but turned out to be an 8-hour drive due to the heavy snow. It had gotten dark out quite early, and it was around midnight as we drove around Alcaguin Park. It was deadly quiet and pitch black, except for the headlights of the car. We finally passed through the park, with only about half-hour left to get to the cottage. It had stopped snowing, and we were both eager to get there. As we turned onto the familiar road, I remember my dad cursing. It hadn't been plowed yet. This wasn't surprising, however. It probably wouldn't be until later the next day that we would even see a snowplow. As we drove down the road, I noticed there was a fresh set of tracks. The Smiths must be up for the weekend, my dad had said, and all of a sudden as we drove around the bend following the tire tracks, the headlights of the car shone on a white van that was parked on the side of the road. It was almost hidden by the vast trees that were covered with snow. "What the?" my dad mumbled. As we drove past the white van, I remember looking back through the back window and seeing 2 figures in the front seat, illuminated by our retreating taillights. I told my dad this and he shrugged. Maybe they're lost? I nodded but couldn't help think about how it was a dead-end road and why they would feel the need to park there. As we pulled into our driveway and started bringing our stuff in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't stop thinking about the van and why it was there, with 2 people just sitting in the dark in the middle of the night. It spooked me out so much that I begged my dad to let me sleep upstairs with him, instead of sleeping downstairs in the room my sister and I usually shared. It had big windows with no blinds that looked out into the blackness of the forest, and my 15-year-old self was already scared of the dark, even without the white van. It wasn't a big deal when my sister was there, but not tonight. As my dad got ready for bed, I sat in the living room reading a book. My dad had turned off all the lights, and I was using just a small lamp next to the couch to try and get through the last chapter before bed. It was so quiet, I could almost hear my ears ringing. I started to get the feeling that I was being watched. The living room had large windows, also with no curtains, that overlooked the lake, and it was black, except for a light or 2 from cottages across the lake. I shut off the lamp and got up. Now that the cottage was dark, the moon was shining brightly, illuminating the snow. It was beautiful, and I walked towards the window to get a better look. Movement caught my eye, and I remember my heart dropping as I saw two figures down by the back porch, below the window, barely hidden by the surrounding trees. I dropped to the floor and crawled towards the bedroom where my dad was sleeping, my heart in my throat. I wasn't sure if they had seen me or not, but I woke my dad up, and by the time he got to the window, the two figures were gone. Where I had seen the figures, two sets of footprints in the snow led back around to the front of the cottage and back down to the driveway. I begged my dad not to go outside. He double-checked the locks and turned on the porch lights, hopefully to scare off anyone. My dad wasn't as freaked out as I was, but still set the alarm before he headed back to bed. I remember being very freaked out, and I laid there all night next to my dad, terrified I'd look out the window and see someone staring back at me. The next morning, my dad went outside and confirmed that there were two sets of footprints leading from the road in behind our cottage, and then back around the front of the cottage and back up the road. There were tire marks that showed the vehicle had turned around and then gone back up the main road. My dad guessed that they were probably looking to break in and steal stuff as it was the middle of winter and not too many people went up to the lake. But they knew we were there. They would have seen our tire tracks leading to our cottage and my dad's car parked out front. They also may have seen the lamp I had turned on to read and/or see it go off. My dad didn't have an answer to that, and after much back and forth, he called the non-emergency line and reported it. Apparently there had been some break-ins in the area. Some stuff had been stolen from some cottages that were boarded up for the winter. But again, I still wonder to this day why they would be interested in stealing from a house that clearly had people in it. Or perhaps their intentions were far darker than we initially anticipated. I was in the 4th week of summer camp. I was a camp counselor up in the mountains. It was the weekend, and during that time there were no campers on site. It was only us 7 counselors. Everyone but Alex was chilling in the break room. Alex was assigned to stay in the Hawk cabin alone because he was the only guy working that weekend. It was late, and Alex had gone to sleep. He started to dream. In his dream, he saw a little girl dancing on top of one of the bunk beds and singing, "I'm Riley, I'm Riley." Then she looked at Alex and jumped off the bunk bed and broke her leg. In a panic, Alex woke up to check on the room for any little girl. The room was empty, but Alex was too spooked to go back to sleep. He went down to the break room for some company. A minute or two later, our boss walked in and asked Alex, "Who was that little girl who stumbled out of your room?" A few days after everyone had stopped crapping their pants, a new batch of campers arrived. On the first day, we took a bunch of campers on a hike. On the trail, we were singing camping songs and getting to know everyone. My campers were telling me all the cool dreams they remember. I told them about this dream I had where there was 0 gravity. Then this girl in front of me turns around and said she had a scary dream a few nights ago. She dreamt that she was in Hawk cabin and there was a little girl trying to dance around with a broken leg. Back in 5th grade, my class and I went on a trip to camp in the mountains for a week. Typical camp: archery, rock climbing, and so on. My teacher did tell us a disturbing story about the little girl that drowned in the lake. For context, the lake where the kids take out canoes is also a swimming area in the summer. It was winter when I went, so the water was too cold for that. However, apparently there were large reeds growing in the area that you could hide behind back then, and this little girl didn't know how to swim, so she headed off from the group to practice swimming in private to avoid being made fun of. However, she went to a spot that was deceptively deep and sank. No one found her until she'd already died. Now, the part that I instantly dismissed as BS was when he went on to say that some nights you can hear her crying. Well, one night, I woke up late, having to pee worse than I ever did in my life. They made us drink a lot of water up there, and the windows were all open because my teacher was a very fat man. Everyone was asleep, and I heard it. Out there in the window, I could hear in the distance the crying of a little girl. I was under the covers, fighting back the urge to pee, scared out my mind. Eventually I ran out as fast as I could to use the bathroom and carefully crept back to my bed. The crying had stopped, and I didn't hear it on any other night. Just so that you know, the boys' cabin was small, and if some kid was crying in there, everyone would have heard it and woken up. Same for the girls' cabin, but there would be no way to hear a girl crying for the boys' cabin unless she was screaming bloody murder. Some other kids claimed to have heard it too, which I don't know the sincerity of. Lots of kids like to say stuff to get attention. I could swear it was within 10 meters of the cabin, just wandering outside. To this day, it brings chills up my spine. How clear the crying was, how genuine it sounded, and the fact that I was skeptical about it beforehand. I don't know if it was the ghost of the little girl, but it certainly was scary. This story happened in 2005, right when the Motorola Razr flip phone had just taken the world by storm. It had reached my tiny mountain village, a relic of its former glory. It used to be a mining town, maybe in the late 1800s or something, but whatever natural resource they had been trying to get out of the ground had since dried up. There were many abandoned houses in the outside parts of town that had been left to be consumed by nature, and were for the most part forgotten about. But in our rural community, us kids had a legend of a house that stood near the entrance of the mine that many referred to as the Master House. It wasn't so much of a house as a 2-story cabin in the woods, as I would eventually learn. The story goes that they were the mining master's family, and they all lived there right next to the mine, surely so the master could come home from work quicker, no doubt. But on the day the mine closed, they fled for whatever reason, leaving all their possessions behind, clothes, plates, everything of value. It strikes pretty much all us kids as odd, and leads to a lot of questions. Of course, at this point, the house had been there for probably 100 years, although I can't say for sure. Anyway, one day, me and my friends were pretty bored, hanging out at one of our friends' houses. We were just playing Xbox, and it was about 7 o'clock, deep in the summer, so it was still bright out, when someone had the bright idea to go and check out this house. None of us had actually ever been, and although I was apprehensive at first, the thought did seem enticing. It was finally something new in this town of stale and boredom. So off we went. We packed into my friend's car and drove to the trailhead, with flashlights in arms. It was still light out, but about 8 o'clock at this point, and the sun by 10 would be well and truly gone. I believe it was about a 45-minute walk, so flashlights just on to provide that extra illumination among the thick trees. We pressed on. It took us a while. We spoke excitedly, wondering what treasures we would find there that obviously kids in the past 100 years hadn't of course discovered when we went to the house. By the time we reached it, I realized it wasn't a house at all, but a cabin. It was pretty creepy, to say the least, and in the dying light, especially more so. Us friends stood at the base of the cabin, petrified. We don't know why. To this day, we can't explain what it was, but it felt like all the sounds suddenly disappeared when we reached it. The air and wind didn't move or stir, and the animals that we'd been hearing on our walk suddenly were silent. We looked up at the door. It had definitely been withered by age, sun-bleached and everything. I walked up the 2 steps made of stone to the cabin and pushed open, to no resistance. Inside was darkness. The dank and dusty smell hit us immediately. It smelt like something had died in there, and it probably had. We walked in tentatively and saw that other people had definitely already left their impression on the place. Graffiti on the walls, "Andy was here," and the like scattered all over the walls. There were a few relics of the past though, some spoons and plates that were clearly visible in open drawers, from other treasure hunters no doubt, seeking a prize after their long hike. We looked around the downstairs kitchen. The stairs were in the middle of the room, and we made our way over to the living space. There were 3 couches that were still there, although rotting and quite disgusting to look at. We could see a spring poking out through one of these. One of my friends remarked that one of them looked newer, not as ancient as the others, and wondered if perhaps this had been an addition that someone had put in later, like forming a clubhouse in this derelict old cabin. Why anyone would do so, I have no idea. After we'd seen the downstairs, the upstairs is what interested us. We shined our flashlights up the stairs, and with trepidation, I started taking the first few steps, each step protesting with a loud creak as I pushed my weight and marched further up into the darkness. I shined my flashlight to the left to see some bedrooms, and then slowly to the right. The door was ajar, and as I approached the ajar door and pushed it open, I dropped my flashlight and let out a scream. Someone had actually brought up a mannequin and dressed it in what I assume were the clothes of the people who lived there, this long, frilly dress. All my friends started laughing, because clearly they had not had the fright of thinking you were being greeted by an ancient ghost. We all laughed. We looked around each and every room, my friend finding some old faded papers and seeing if he could make out any of the words, but ultimately, the quest, although enjoyable in part, didn't hold much fun, seeing as everyone else had come here before us. My friends and I were decidedly done with this little adventure, and thought it'd be best to go home. The night was nearly fully upon us, and the thought of going through the forest in the darkness wasn't that appealing, as I wasn't sure if our flashlights would hold all the way back. We all went down the stairs when a friend said he needed to wee, so he went outside and round the side to do his business. We were all just kind of lingering in the hallway, taking one last look, when we heard a few footsteps from above. I shouted up and asked who was still up there and to get down because we were leaving them behind, but no one replied. I then looked around. There were 5 of us, and downstairs here in the room were 4 of us, with my friend outside doing his business. I did a double take and recounted. Right as I was finishing my second count, I heard 1 step, as if someone moved a single step upstairs and shifted their weight onto one leg. A creak from the floorboards. My friends looked at me, and I at them. And in the few moments it took for all of us to realize that something was not quite right, we bolted out the door. We didn't look back, but the friend who was taking a wee shouted out after us asking what was going on. It was only after we had rejoined the path and were in the tree line did our friend finally run over to us and ask what happened. When we told him what we'd heard, he said it was surely some kind of animal, or the wind, or just the house itself creaking, and to not be chickens. Now that we had left the house, it didn't seem so scary, but we still needed to make it home. As we started walking, I put my hands in my pockets, and that's when a dawning realization hit me. My phone wasn't there. I searched everywhere, asked my friends if they'd taken it as a joke. You see, I'd been using my new Motorola phone and showing it off to take pictures of this decrepit cabin. I knew that I must have left it in the house. I really didn't want to go back. So a friend, Sam, decided to come with me, and the others would wait by the trees. We started making our way into the house. We pushed through the door and looked around the downstairs. To this day, I still don't know why I did this, but I began opening the drawers of the kitchen, seeing if someone had stuffed it in one as a joke, even though all of them claimed not to. When I opened one of the bottom drawers, inside I saw a decomposing bird, and that genuinely frightened me. After deducing that the phone definitely wasn't downstairs, we started making our way upstairs, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Something didn't feel right, and those noises had definitely spooked me. But I wanted my phone. It was expensive, and there was no way I was going to be able to afford another one. We looked in the rooms on the left-hand side first, but there was nothing. Finally, it was time to look in the mannequin room. My friend had left the door ajar, the last one out, surely to scare the next people who came up here. I pushed open the door, and right there, at the foot of the mannequin, was my phone. The thing that I find hardest to believe is how on earth it got there. You see, after my initial scare, I didn't even bother looking in that room, and that was on the doorway. I turned around and left. It was a few spaces between me and the mannequin. I would have had to throw my phone in order for it to reach where it was at the mannequin's feet. My only logical conclusion was that one of my friends took it from me and left it there. It then started to dawn on me that one of my friends must have done it on purpose, and they were waiting to see my face when they were going to ask me where I'd found it. I thought that must have been the most logical conclusion, and started to make my way back down the stairs. We ran out the house and closed the door, not wanting to wait and see if we heard any more noises as we left. When we rejoined my friends, one of them asked why the hell we were playing with the dress. I asked them what they meant, and they said it wasn't really necessary to try and make out I'd lost my phone if we were just trying to scare them. I asked them what the hell they meant. Sam looked at me in surprise. We hadn't done anything. I told them I'd only gone in to find my phone, but I didn't say where I found it. Then they looked at each other and asked why I was moving the mannequin around the room. I gave them a confused look. They went on to explain that after we'd gone into the house, it appeared that the mannequin, which was visible via the window, moved around a little, moved from side to side, and then back down in the chair. I looked at them in horror and instinctually turned back to the window where the mannequin should have been visible, but there was nothing there. Without thinking, all of us began running. It wasn't until we reached the end of the trail and were back in the car, exhausted and panting, did all of us tell our sides of the story. Our friends adamantly said that none of them had moved my phone. One of them recalled that I had put it on the side after taking a picture of one of the plates and my friend holding one of the spoons. But that was the last place he saw it, as he was too busy taking photos on his phone. Regardless, I still don't know what happened that night. I trust my friends implicitly, and after their reactions genuinely don't believe that they had any hand in the moving of my phone, as I am also sure that they are not lying to me about us playing with the mannequin. There was no outright accusation of it being spooky happenings in an attempt to scare us. They thought we were trying to scare them, and pathetically at that, as they didn't even contemplate the possibility of it being paranormal. I'm not sure what it was. It was dusk after all. There was very little light. Maybe it was a trick of the light. At least, that's what I try and tell myself. But what I know for sure is that I will never be going back to that cabin or encouraging anyone else to do so either. One year, when I was at a family cabin in Wisconsin, way up north near Superior, I was sitting in the living room area while the rest of the family was sleeping, when I heard some noises coming from the backyard that sounded like someone was messing with the shed doors or firewood stacks. The motion lights came on, and I could see a shadow through the kitchen window that passed by too quickly to get a look at. I was too afraid to even move, and just stared at the back windows and patio door, which had blinds drawn over it. I'd say about a minute later, I heard something that sounded like the door trying to be slid open. It got louder and louder, till I instinctively screamed and jumped up. It stopped when I screamed, and my stepdad came running out of the bedroom. He asked what happened, and I told him, and he told me that I was exaggerating, and then, at that moment, whatever it was pounded on the glass door and tried opening it again. He grabbed a shotgun off the wooden gun rack and pulled it up to the blind. When he didn't see anything, he pressed his face up to the glass to see around the door into the back wooded area. He still saw nothing, so he opened the door to try and scare them off. I was standing perhaps 5 feet behind him, and we both saw something large and bipedal run from far behind the shed into the woodline. It screamed like I've never heard an animal scream. He let off one shot as it vanished into the darkness. We haven't spoken of that night in 20 years, petrified of what it could have been. I figured I'd share my experience living in a 200-year-old cabin. All of these things happened over the span of a 3-year period that I lived there in the beginning of 2012. A childhood friend of mine from years back asked me if I would be her roommate. I needed out of my parents, and she needed a roommate, and it seemed like a good situation. Now for the house. Nestled in a suburban area was this cabin. It dated back to sometime in the 1700s. The road the cabin is off bears the same name as the original family of the house. They owned a large portion of the land, and is now one of the largest cities in the US. Search American colonial cabin, and you'll see a swath of images that look like it. We originally think it was used as slave quarters, as this is tobacco country, and then later found out it was a stable house. The stable house theory checks out, as our dog dug up a horseshoe once, which I still own. The night we moved in, the place was eerie. No door to the upstairs, my room, no door to the downstairs bedroom. Her bedroom was an addition that someone had added in the 80s. The previous owners also added a much-needed kitchen and bathroom, as the original layout didn't have either. Now that you get a decent imagery of what I was working with, I'll start explaining why I'm sharing this. When moving in, I immediately felt like I was being watched. The house always felt dark, cold, and moist, much like a cellar. I suppose that might be the kind of thing you'd expect with that type of house, but there was something else. It started with scratching. Every night that I would be in bed, I would be awoken to this scratching directly underneath my bed, near my head. At first I thought it was mice, but then I listened long enough to realize that the scratching was a long draw, like a foot-long pull, then repeated. I just covered my head, muffled my ears, and closed my eyes. I was a 23-year-old dude, and I felt like I was cowering, but I was not about to tussle with wood-scratching spirits. So one night, while I'm in bed, I heard it start. Usually I would be asleep, but this time I was awake late. It started on the ceiling, on the far right of the room. It then went down the wall, then scratched its way to directly underneath me. After a while, the scratching went across the room and back to the wall, then gone. Here's why it's not mice. My walls were solid wood, as the inside logs was the same as the outside. The floor had no space between the ceiling below and the floor above. Like I said, an old cabin. Alright, so I'm gonna speed things up. I got scared and started sleeping downstairs. My roommate, now wife, asked what was up. and I told her. She said the same stuff was going on when she's home alone. This was in the first week. Here's the creepy part. When we moved in, I had to unscrew all of the screws that the previous renters had put on the windows. I had to unscrew one of the exterior doors that he screwed shut, and we had to clean out the weird rabbit food from the oven. We had to write "doesn't live here" on hundreds of mail order catalogs the previous renter received. We always joke the guy was a shut-in Satanist, but now we think we weren't too off. We both started sleeping downstairs in the living room and felt comfortable in numbers. The eerie feeling was easier to deal with if someone was with you. Until one night, I had a dream that a dark force was approaching me. It was in the third person, as if I was watching myself sleep. The entity starts looming over my head, and all the while I feel a pressure building in my head and a high-pitched ringing in my ears. It got so intense that I sprung up from my sleep and look around the room. About a second later, the TV shut off, just cut off. We'd been having problems with the TV randomly turning on and off, but this time was far too coincidental to be brushed off like everything else. Also, I knew I went to bed with the TV turned off. I cut it off. Why was it on in the first place? We started sleeping in her room after that night. She told me nothing really happened in her room. Maybe because it was an addition, I don't know. Well, our ghosts played matchmaker and were now trying for a kid. Married for 5 years. Anywho, once I was upstairs reading and I was falling asleep, my windows started opening and shutting. I was already at my wit's end with this spirit, so the next day I set up the same situation, same thing. Funny, never does that when I'm not in there. I ended up yelling, telling it to leave us alone, and that I was tired of its crap. And holy smokes, it kind of worked. For a while anyway. Then when I was home alone, alarm clocks started going off as soon as my wife would leave. Drawers would open and banging on the front. Over time it just stopped, slowed down ultimately to nothing. I guess as I matured it stopped messing with me. Today my in-laws live there. They were my landlords, and the home is cute, homely and warm. Anytime I spend there alone, I no longer feel the malice. I would do it all over again if I had to. Back in 2005, I was on a family vacation in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. We stayed in a cabin in the mountains, 2 bedrooms downstairs, a loft bedroom upstairs. The loft was enclosed but had a large bifold window that could be opened to overlook to the open living room below. I claimed the loft for myself. One night I had gone to bed before everyone else. The bifold window was closed, but the light from the living room leaked through the cracks and dimly lit the room. I put my headphones on, popped my Avril Lavigne CD into my Discman, and laid down into bed. I was on my back, eyes closed, and fumbled around with the CD player trying to change songs. I couldn't quite get it, so I opened my eyes to try and see where the button was. When I did, there was nothing but darkness. I was confused because of the light from the window was gone, and the room was pitch black. I suddenly realized something was covering my eyes because it began moving away from me, revealing the edges of its body in the light from the window. I stared, frozen, at this creature, flew back, ending in the upper corners of the bedroom. It started disappearing into the shadows. I pulled the sheets over my head, crushed my eyes closed, and turned up the volume as loudly as it would go. I ended up passing out that night. The next morning I was telling my mum what happened, and she told me she'd also had a strange experience early that morning. She was sitting on the edge of her bed putting socks on when one of the dresser drawer handles started lifting and dropping against the dresser. She watched it continue for a minute before reaching over and holding it down. Then another started doing it. She held that one down as well. When a third one started going, she bolted out of the room. Several years later, I was relaying this story to a new friend, and his response to the creature's physical description was, "Sounds like a wraith," and I admittedly didn't know what that was. He pulled up images to show me, and tears began rolling down my face. Not sad, but just my body's response, which was weird to me. It was exactly what I had seen that night, and that's one of the creepiest experiences of my life. Rather than giving my boyfriend a traditional Christmas gift, I booked us a weekend at a cabin on Airbnb. We weren't super outdoorsy people, so I spent a lot of time searching for something with just the right amount of privacy. I wanted something secluded, but not desolate due to our lack of experience. I settled on a place on the outskirts of a 500-acre farm. It was right on the river and had an outhouse and outdoor cooking amenities. The weekend finally comes, and we were so excited to escape for a few days. It's only an hour and a half from our house, but proved a bit tricky to find. The owner sent us the classic turn in at the sign, left at the fork, right at the tree directions to follow once we made it to the approximate address he gave us. After ending up at another rental on the property and bumping into the housekeeper, we were finally on track to reach our cabin. We drove past pigs, cows, and the main farmhouse. It was beautiful and serene until we got to the final stretch of road. It was more of a hiking trail, barely big enough for our truck. It was bumpy and winding and treacherous as hell. After hyperventilating for 10 minutes or so in the passenger seat, we finally reached the bottom of the mountain, cross a stream, and pull up to the cabin. The first day and night go as planned. We met one of the farmhands our first day, and the owner of the farm the second. Both were extremely friendly and helpful. Around 7 p.m. the second day, a truck pulls up and parks beside ours. We figured it was one of the people we had met, or maybe someone else from the farm stopping by to say hi. But we were wrong. 3 guys hop out of the truck and wave at us as if they're meant to be there. We're sitting on the front porch of the cabin, and my dog, a 90-pound German Shepherd, starts going nuts. Not only is it intimidating, it's loud as hell. I take him to the other side of the cabin and send my boyfriend to see who these people are. One of the guys asks him, "How's the fishing here?" My boyfriend replies that we haven't been here long, and he says we should ask the owner who lives on the property. The guy says something along the lines of, "Oh yeah, I know, we live around here, just looking for a fishing spot." Okay. I text the owner to let him know what's going on, but he doesn't reply. The guys fan out and begin taking pictures of the property that I know I was in. They start making videos of the property and themselves and are speaking another language. Naturally, I start sketching out and text the guy again, but he doesn't reply. They leave after a little while, and I text the owner letting him know they're on their way back up along with the make and model of their truck, but I still don't get a reply. We agree that none of us would be sleeping that night, so we packed our stuff and left. It's been 2 days and still nothing from the owner. I only interacted with him a few times, but when I did, he was so personable. It just seems out of character for him to not say anything at all. It could have been nothing, but it was obvious these guys had been there before and were not looking for a fishing spot. This was not a public place and wasn't easily accessible by any means. They knew which way to go to end up at a river and were completely comfortable driving miles through clearly marked private property, passing the main farmhouse and driving down a mountain. For what? I do not know, but I'm glad I never found out. When I was young, I lived on a farm with my family that had some pretty freaky urban legends attached to it, even to the point that a lot of my indigenous family refused to visit out of fear. How the story goes is there was an evil creature that lived at the bottom of the hill and came out at night to torment and play tricks on people. I never believed in that stuff, even as a kid, but one night I started having vivid, almost real feeling nightmares about being chased by it around the property. It got so bad that it ended up putting me in therapy. After a year of being haunted by this thing, I tried to tell my family that I wanted to move because of how real these nightmares were, but they just thought I had a wild imagination. It wasn't only the nightmares that made this so horrifying though. Some days, we'd find ravished chickens, and other days goats would go missing. I'd have friends stay over and never come back, and sometimes late at night, we'd hear something chasing our horse in the field, and she'd go crazy and scream into the early hours of the morning. Me and my sister started to believe that this thing was very real. One day, a friend of the family's came to visit, and stayed in the cabin down the back of the property, which was the first night I'd managed to have a proper sleep in months. That night, the friend of my parents had the worst nightmares he'd ever had, and left early the next morning to never visit again. He said as he was packing, something chased him in his dreams, and when he woke up, he heard muffled crying outside the cabin, and it was shaking, as if something was hitting the sides of the building with full force. The look of fear on that man's face still haunts me to this day. The man was shaking and crying as he drove away, and my parents refused to discuss it with us. Later on that day, my sister and I walked down to the cabin to find it was on a lean, and the inside looked like it'd been hit by an earthquake. My parents sold the farm and moved away a few months after that, and I never had those nightmares again. A few years later, my siblings and I were sent an article about the farm and a murder-suicide that happened after the husband that bought the property went insane, stabbed his wife to death, and shot himself in the head. My parents refused to talk about it, but sometimes my siblings and cousins bring it up in conversation, sharing the trauma it caused us and our friends that refused to come back after the horrible night terrors they experienced there. The entire town is messed up. Everyone that leaves that township has a traumatizing story that's either logic-based or supernatural. So many terrible things have happened there that I wouldn't be surprised if there's something more sinister living on that land. If you want to go down a depressing wormhole, look up Boroville Murders. It's our very little Australian version of Dairy. I'm not sure if the whole thing was in my mind or a real horror story, but after finding out about the murders that happened a couple of years later, I'm starting to believe that thing is still there and entering people's nightmares, butchering the local wildlife and terrorizing whoever buys up that land. We stayed in a rustic cabin built in the 70s for my bachelorette party. So old, but not that old. It's in Lake Luzerne, New York. To set the scene, this happened the first night. 6 girls in total, 2 right outside the kitchen doors barbecuing dinner, and the other 4 sitting around the kitchen table. It was a small kitchen with a table right near the kitchen counter and sink. We hadn't really started drinking or anything. I think we had one shot that our bartender friend had made us using a cocktail shaker. I say this because the top of the shaker was sitting right near the actual shaker on the counter. I remember seeing this. Next comes the spooky part. Very suddenly and out of nowhere, the shaker top flew across the room about 5 feet, very close to my friend. We all saw it. My brain, in trying to make sense of things, thought my friend outside had thrown the top at us as a joke, but I knew it was on the counter and she was outside. I could tell that my friends didn't know how to react. I think some of them jumped up. Some of us started asking questions about what just happened, and then eventually, we all ran outside screaming. Long story short, we decided to ignore it, shrug it off. I was always taught to not give power to those things, but I do know that the top flew across the room. It didn't slide off the counter by gravity. There was no sudden rush of wind. It was thrown across the room. I've never experienced anything like it. Nothing else really happened on the trip. My friend swears she heard low, deep voices coming from the TV while she was watching Netflix. My other friend backs this story. I don't know what to believe. So yeah, Airbnbs can be haunted. No one said anything in the reviews, and I didn't either. This was back in 2017. I was in the church at the time, and we did the Pioneer Trail because my mum convinced me to do it even though I wasn't thrilled. I had an uneasy feeling. I didn't know why until after the first night. So we're walking the Pioneer Trail for about 10 miles. At this point we stopped for a break. I ate like everyone else, but I can't shake the feeling that something is watching. I decided not to say anything because I was, like, that's stupid, there's nothing here besides us. So I thought we were here to proceed with our normal activities. And I had eaten takis that night, spicy chips, and had to go to the bathroom, which I did. Then I went back to the cabin after a long day's activities, ready to sleep. However, before I fell asleep, I heard a branch snap. I didn't think much of it, but then I heard another, and another. And when I thought, alright, something's up, I decided to look out the window to see what was out there. When I saw it, I was shaken to my core. I saw this long, white, skinny creature. You could see the rib cage, red eyes burning, and it looked human, but wrong. Its skin was mainly transparent, and it was sniffing. It looked like it was sniffing around the forest looking for something. I stared at it for a bit, watching it sniff the air, its back to me. However, it eventually began turning its body slowly in my direction. That's when I quickly went and hid back in my bunk. What the hell was that thing? Was I going crazy? And of course, while I'm thinking these thoughts, I could hear more branches breaking. But I decided not to put my head back to the window. However, I woke up one of my cabin mates, and he looked at me so long, I had that terrified look on my face. "Hey, you good, Leo? Looks like you saw a ghost." Gave me a little chuckle. "You don't want to know what I saw, but I want you to look with me." He said, "Okay, there's nothing out there but..." And as we looked out, it was still there, a little closer than before. It wasn't facing us, so we decided to duck our heads back and try and sleep. Then I could hear tons of branches breaking again, but we decided not to look, and we closed the blinds. About half hour later, I opened them again, but it had left. All that was left were a ton of broken branches. We didn't know what to do, but we fell back asleep. And of course, we decided not to tell our counselors exactly what it was. We told them we thought we heard a bear or something in the night, and they sent a group out to investigate, but couldn't find anything besides a few odd prints. We knew what it was, and I haven't been back to Pioneer Trail since. I took a trip to stay in a cabin in the middle of the woods, high up in the mountains of the city of Ranger, Georgia, USA. This neighborhood was 30 minutes up the mountain, away from civilization, and even the cabins were spread far apart. The front deck of the cabin was completely exposed to the woods, so I acknowledged that any animals could stroll along if they pleased. But I stayed there for about a week, and me and my boyfriend sat outside on the front deck every night, very late, and at no point felt in danger. It was peaceful with fireflies out and sounds of crickets every night, until the 5th night. It was eerily dark too. The moon was covered heavily. It was about midnight, and all of a sudden, I didn't feel a peace like I did those other nights. The forest went completely quiet, and I felt a horrible sense of dread, and I genuinely feared for my life. I sat there in my chair, looking out into the dark forest, trying to rationalize and calm myself down that it was my mind playing tricks on me. But all of a sudden, my boyfriend said out loud that he felt unsafe. I told him I felt the same, and we ran inside. The cabin has 3 floors, and we were able to climb out the window and sit on the roof because we wanted to be still and relax outside. Didn't matter how high up I felt, I could still feel that something was truly wrong and stayed inside. The only other time I felt something like that was when someone was watching me, and an experience I had within a haunted house. If anyone could share similar experiences or give insight, I'd appreciate it. When I was younger, my friends and I used to go ghost hunting in abandoned buildings. There's a small cabin near where I live that everyone swears is haunted, so we decided to go check it out for ourselves. But in order to reach the cabin, you have to walk through a gate in the fence. It's not really a gate, more of a pathway that leads through the fence. So you go left and then right through the posts. We go through and get to the cabin, and we're looking around. It's kind of spooky but nothing crazy. I decide to go outside and look around the fields, and I hear my friend, a then 17-year-old girl, scream. A death-curdling scream, like she'd seen someone get murdered. My other friend and I both run to check on her. He was somewhere else in the house. She was found in the fetal position in the corner of the kitchen, head down, bawling her eyes out. All the cabinets and drawers were open, even though they had previously been closed. We tried to ask her what happened, but she just cried and said she wanted to leave. We walked back to the cars, and on one of the posts of the fence that you have to walk through was a dandelion in a pile of dirt, like it was dug up and placed there, which obviously wasn't there when we had entered. We went home and that was that. It was creepy, and my friend to this day will not tell us what she saw. I was in Vermont to see some friends, and we found a cabin deep in the woods through Airbnb to spend the night. I had maybe a drink or two while no one else drank. It was a good day full of laughter, and I was now the only one left awake at midnight. I was downstairs in the living room enjoying the cabin and contemplating life. There were no blinds or curtains on any windows in the cabin, which I found strange. There were many windows, and each showed the pitch-black darkness of the wilderness outside. I went upstairs to sleep in a room shared by my best friend, in a separate bed. Before laying down, I stared out the window of the room, thinking again how odd it would be that there were no blinds or curtains. I remember thinking how someone could probably spot me from a mile away through this window. I lay down and instantly fell asleep. I woke up to my best friend standing over me with his hands squeezed around my neck. We were both screaming at the top of our lungs and wrestled for our lives in the darkness of the room. We fought for a good minute, all the while screaming and destroying the room. Glass was shattered, the furniture was moved around the room, and eventually, my friend came to his senses and turned on the light while we both tried to make sense of this mess. My only recollection was waking up to my friend screaming and choking me by the neck. He seems to remember me standing over him and threatening him. He says he felt overcome with rage and attacked me at this point. We both went downstairs and tried to talk through it. We had a few main questions we couldn't answer. We had both been asleep for 10 minutes by the time we started fighting. REM sleep can't occur within 10 minutes, so it could not be dream-induced. Our other friends in the next room heard nothing and didn't wake up to the noise. After about half hour downstairs, I felt the most horrifying dread I've ever experienced. Thinking my death was certainly imminent, I went into a full panic attack and started screaming to wake everyone up and to leave the cabin. We all packed and left within the hour. What are some possible explanations? The owners of the Airbnb checked the CO2 monitors and they were fine. They were never told the full story, but we agreed to pay damages for the room. What do you think it could have been?